Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here again on Victorious Friday with a very special guest, a good friend as well. And as we walk through this, we've been walking together for many, many years. In fact, as a centurion, as part of the Colson Center, John and I have been together for, John, I think it's well over a decade now. When I received the centurion, it was probably back in 2007, I want to say. Hey, welcome to the show, my friend.
Well, it's always good to see you, Terrence. I wish you were in person, but since we're locked down on opposite ends of the country still, we'll hopefully see each other this year.
Well, hopefully we can get back and get back in the air. I was just telling you
Absolutely.
before the end of this year, Delta had me as one of the top 10% of flyers, and it's not something I esteem for, but it was quite a busy year in 2019. 2020 went to a halt. Of course, 2021, we'll see where that goes. We're praying
Yeah.
for recovery for so many, and we certainly give our respects and condolences to those family members who've lost loved ones. And so um, it's been a tough, challenging year. But you know what? When I look at 2020, it really kind of, I think, it was a wake up call for all of us as
Mm.
well.
Yeah, I
And
think so. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things, Terrence. One of the things we've been thinking a lot about is, we talked a lot about the pre-existing physical conditions to COVID, that, comorbidities, things that made the virus even more dangerous.
Mhm.
I think we're seeing an awful lot of social ones too,
Yeah.
cultural ones. Right now we're getting these numbers that are just dreadful from the CDC and other places, from states, about suicide rates, about addiction rates, particularly among young people. Now, these are things that pre-existed COVID, but COVID made them worse. They're kind of, it's almost like COVID's the comorbidity on what we have come to call deaths from despair. And I think there are other things as well. I think, for example, gosh, how quickly the United States political figures, elected officials, and many Christians just kind of quickly accepted that church is non-essential, right? And the question is when we come back, not only are we going to be able to regain our Delta status, but are we going to actually be able to see church as being an essential part of ordering our lives? I mean, these are real questions that seem to suggest that COVID's going to be a game changer, culturally speaking, for many of us, kind of a break where these trends that were kind of in the system suddenly, get spiked. And I think it's going to be interesting to see.
I think you're right on. Well, brother, what I like to do to start out is let our audience get to know who you are. Tell us a little bit about yourself. As I know you as president of the Colson Center, but I know you wear a lot of titles and a lot of hats. And what I'm proud of is the fact that your husband and father and all that good
Mhm.
stuff. But give us a little background on you, my friend.
Well, let's begin there. I've got three daughters. My wife, Sarah, and I have been married now for 17 years. Our daughters are 15, 13, and 11. And we thought we were done. And then our three daughters conspired against us and prayed for about 6 years that God would give them a little brother. And they won. So literally, we go 15, 13, 11. There's an 8-year gap. And now we
Nice.
also have a 3-year-old son. So it was a surprise, the caboose, as many people say,
Yeah.
but man, life has been great. It's
That's
it's
the
it's all
power of
it's a lot
prayer,
of fun.
man. That's all.
Well, listen, there's no doubt in my mind that God likes their prayers better than mine because they won. And I tell you, it's been spectacular. Not only, I mean, listen, he brings lots of joy into our home. He's, boys and girls. For people who say there's no difference between boys and girls, I can't even fathom that, just from the differences and things that shouldn't be different but are. But also just watching my daughters flourish as big sisters, it just kind of struck a chord in their hearts, and God grew them up in some really cool ways. And so that's been a lot of fun. And yeah, I'm the president of an organization called the Colson Center. It's one of the legacy organizations of the late, and I would say great, Chuck Colson. Obviously, we know his tremendous work in the prisons for many years, kind of a reflection of his own personal testimony, having gone to prison, convicted in a Watergate-related charge, and coming out as a new man, and spent the rest of his life taking the gospel back into the prisons, dealing with the issues of incarceration, issues of justice, and so on, which also led him to spend an awful lot of time trying to help the church understand culture, understand what was happening in the world, being able to apply a Christian worldview across the board to all of life. Realizing that something was broken in the culture that was leading to the brokenness he was seeing in the prisons. And of course, the prison population during his life exploded, and that had to do with all kinds of factors. But he also realized too that the church was always at its best when it ran into the problems, ran into the brokenness, not out of them. And so that led him to start a daily commentary called BreakPoint, which many people might remember hearing on radio, from Washington, D.C. It's Chuck Colson with BreakPoint, with that kind of deep, raspy voice. And it's been one of the great honors of my life to carry that on. Now it's more than just on the radio. It's a podcast and email, and people can find that. We just kind of try to take a daily story or headline or topic and try to bring a Christian perspective to it, both as a way so that Christians can better understand the culture, but also kind of as a way of, showing that, what, our faith makes good sense of the world. We don't have to keep our faith in church on Sundays and then, bring a completely different perspective to bear Monday to Friday. That Christianity actually is true. With a capital T. And if Christians can think that way, not only can we survive kind of the chaos of the culture, we can actually make a difference in the world. Yeah. And of course, we've seen that throughout history. So that's really what we do. You mentioned the Centurions program. That program continues under the name Colson Fellows. And it's been, we have about 500 people in 46 cities across America, and even 4 international cities studying with us over the course of a year, just wanting to go deeper in their own leadership development. And so that's been a lot of fun to see that grow. And so that's what I do for work, and that's my family. And God's been really good to us, really kind to us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's good, man. So there's a couple of changes I have to make. One, I've got to change my whole thing from Centurion to Colson Fellows. Right.
You may change it, but it's completely up to you. We've had some that are like, no, man, I'm a Centurion.
Right.
I'm going to stick, which is great. Yeah.
I mean, I got to get an invite to the party, man. I got to get an invite somewhere. Come on. I mean, that's probably why I'm missing out on the invites, because I haven't changed my
you haven't
official
changed your
title.
name. Yeah. No,
so,
it's good.
So that's one reason I realized why I'm left out. Now I feel better. The second thing, though, man, you just told me earlier, it's not about the radio, it's commentary now. You're moving up to this whole sophisticated, way of networking with people and connecting with people. So I'm going to ding you on that radio thing and talk about commentary.
Radio still matters. Radio's still a big deal. But a lot of people spend a lot of time on social media, and certainly we all look at our email. I mean, most of us look at our emails before we get out of bed in the morning, right? So, it's just, they're all ubiquitous ways. We just live in an age where people can get in touch with us all the time, for better or for worse.
Well, brother, we're here as Victorious Family. Our passion is to see families thrive. And we think in order for that to happen, it needs to have a foundation of a biblical foundation, biblical truths implanted in the home. And parents, we have a natural, what I call discipleship group. We have a built-in discipleship group. We're the leaders of the group, and we have our students, our children. And when I think of discipleship, that word is used so loosely. The way we define it is the way one imparts their life to another person's life for them to go and do the same. And our passion is to see a generation, and we think of generation as 25 years, to see an entire generation transformed, to see parents who are equipped and responsible to raise their kids in the Lord. And we based it off of Ephesians 6:4 and Deuteronomy and so many other passages. But Ephesians 6:4 says parents, really, it says fathers, really speaking to parents, don't exasperate your children, frustrate them, which I kind of get an A+ from time to time. But it says to train and instruct them in the Lord. And so one of the reasons that we started this passion is because I was falling short as a spiritual leader in my own home. I was building businesses like Coca-Cola, et cetera, and J&J and Citibank, but I was failing in building a strong, thriving, biblically based family and home front. But not in the way that many people might assume. We were certainly doing what I call the disciplines of faith, church and reading our Bible and sharing, prayer and so forth. But what I was not being responsible for as a father, as a spiritual leader, and being intentional in raising them and teaching them these biblical values and teachings and truths and principles. So as we expand and talk to parents around the world, really, after training 100,000 parents in our curriculum and our workshops and so forth, one of the things that's very important is biblical worldview. And the thing you talk about, John, which is one of the reasons we wanted to have you on today, and John, we'd like for you to address, is really you do work around this, what we call this practical guide to culture. And we believe culture is important. We believe no nation can thrive without a strong, healthy family foundation. So I'd like for you to maybe talk a little bit about that. What tensions do you see? Where do you see things going as we look at trends over the last 10, 20 years versus now? Just give us this idea and principles around practical guide to culture.
Yeah, you bet. Well, thanks. You know, we love our kids, and as Christian dads, we want them to know God. We want them to love God. We want them to trust him, to follow him and obey him. And that would be difficult enough if all we had to deal with were their own kind of independent thinking and their own sin nature, right? If it was completely a vacuum of any external forces, but all it was just dealing with their own hearts and minds, that would still be a challenge. Like I remember when my oldest daughter was just 3 years old, and my middle daughter was just 1, and I was traveling somewhere. My wife called and she said, "You never believe what happened tonight." And I said, "What?" She said, "Well, we were putting the girls to bed, and Abigail was tucking her little sister in, and on the way out the door, she leaned in and said, 'God will be with you tonight, Anna. God will be with you.'" And my wife said, "I thought it was so sweet." But then Abigail looked at me and said, "Mommy, I told Anna that God would be with her, and the other God will be with me." And I thought, oh no, my daughter's a polytheist. How did this happen? She's 3. And of course, she was just trying to make sense of God. And you realize that that's what's happening. But the fact of the matter is even as they're trying to, get their minds wrapped around the who God is and who God's revealed himself, and even as they memorize scripture and try to find a way to take that and live out the truths of scripture in their life, they're not doing it in a vacuum. They're doing it in a context of culture. And the culture is, brings all kinds of pressures and forces to our hearts and minds. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, if you want to know what water is, don't ask the fish. And of course, I told a group of students that, anecdote. And I said, well, why wouldn't you ask the fish? And they're like, I don't know, because fish can't talk. I was like, no, because fish don't know that they're even wet. They don't know that something's not normal. And I think that's one of the things we have to realize as moms and dads. We've seen some dramatic cultural shifts. I mean, every time I speak to moms and dads, or particularly grandparents, they are just dizzy still by how quickly things went in our culture from being unthinkable to unquestionable. And when you think about kind of the hot issues of our culture, which I often, put in 3 categories of sex, technology, and Trump, those are the 3 big categories that are dividing generations. The shifts are just dramatic, and we feel those pressures a lot. But you have to understand, we're immigrants to this, these brave new worlds of, digital technology everywhere, and certainly these kind of hyper-imposed visions of sexual orientation and gender identity. And, we've seen kind of the buildup to this level of political tension. Our kids have never known any different. This is just the world to them. Mm-hmm. And Terence, you travel a lot internationally. So, you don't really realize some of the norms of your culture until you go somewhere else. I took my oldest daughter with me in Australia a couple of years ago. And of course, as soon as we got in a taxi, she was like, "Dad, they're driving on the wrong side of the road." Right. And she didn't even realize that it's not a wrong side of the road, or that what she considered to be the right side of the road was just a cultural norm that could quickly be something else. But that's what we're seeing on some really incredibly significant issues. And so one of the things we have to learn to do is to see what's happening in our cultural moment from the perspective of our faith. And I think what's happening far too often is people are seeing the faith through the perspective of the cultural moment. So as these trends change about sexuality, or as everything gets put, all the weight of our culture gets put on an election or an appointment or a political headline, we do the same thing. And maybe the Christian part of our lives wants to bring some morality to it, but in reality, we're just not discerning these cultural norms and how we should think about these things and how we should be different. I'll give you just one. Chuck Colson used to love to say this: despair is a sin because Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. One of the things we tend to do is take a truth like Jesus is risen from the dead, and we not only make it personal, which it should be, but we make it private, right? In other words, that this is what I believe, but it's not what's true about the world. Listen, the first followers of Jesus, when they said Christ is risen, they weren't saying, I think Christ is risen, or, the fact that Christ is risen brings meaning and purpose to my life. What they were saying is, no, Christ is risen and the whole world's different, right? Christ is risen, so he's king and Caesar is not. So basically, that's what we mean by a biblical worldview. It's taking these fundamental truths of Scripture and seeing all of life as if they're true, because they are. And that's something that all parents have to do if we're going to disciple kids, because we're not just discipling to love God, we're discipling them to love God today. And so we have to navigate the waters that we're in today, the unique challenges of today.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of them, as we all know.
Absolutely. And, these waters are really murky right now. There's
swirling, murky, fast moving. Yeah, it's dizzying.
It really is. And, your kids are going to grow up in a different world,
right?
A different culture than we did. Right.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about some of those challenges that your children will face, which we never even had to think about really, where do you see the difference? I mean, where do you see the most major concerns or impacts or tensions that you have as a parent today versus 10, 20 years ago?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I spend kind of my career looking at this stuff, so I don't want to take too much time. But one of the things we do, my co-author and I, Brett Kunkel, in the book, A Practical Guide to Culture, is we use that motif of water for culture. So what water is to a fish, culture is to a human. And unless you pull them out of it, you don't really realize that you're even in it. And but we experience the waters of our culture in two ways. One is like waves, right? So if you've ever gone to the beach and you got hit by a wave, you felt it, you know it. And of course, there's no question we've been hit by pounding waves, right? The race tension in America has been a wave. It's something that, I kind of think our culture probably assumed, well, that wave had already passed us and now we can move on. And we haven't. It's still an issue. And we still get hammered by that wave. The LGBTQ issues, all the letters of the acronym, they're kind of individual waves, right? I mean, the gay marriage issue was a wave, and now the transgender issue is a wave. The social media, social bullying, addictions, pornography, all of these things are waves. In other words, you feel it. But you maybe have had that experience, Terence, where you've kind of taken your family to the beach or something, and your kids run out into the water, and then you're kind of getting your towel set up or your chair, and you look up and they're not there, and you're like, they were just there a second ago, and then you realize they're just down in the water, maybe 10 or 15 feet to the right or the left, and you realize it wasn't a wave that took them there. They didn't even know they got there, but it was an undercurrent. And I think some of the most important forces of our culture, the ones that parents really need to understand, are the undercurrents, these things that have shifted over decades, and they shift so slowly you don't even notice. But then you look up and you're like, we're not in Kansas anymore. We're somewhere else. Yeah. So I'll give you a handful of them, Terence, that I think are really important. The first one is a shift that we're in as a globe. I mean, if people have looked back historically, then they've learned about different epochs or periods of history, like, the Industrial Revolution or the Age of Exploration or something like that. And that's what historians and sociologists do. They identify these things, the Scientific Revolution. Well, we're in the middle of one of those right now. And because our age is going to always be known as the information age. And it's not just the fact that we now have computers in our home. It's that information has replaced industry, or information has come to dominate every single force on the planet, every single cultural sector of our lives. Now, if you look back, for example, and study the Industrial Revolution, you'll look back and go, this is when the world went from being primarily agrarian and went to being industrialized. We went from farms to factories. And we read about these things, in kind of quick hits as if it happened overnight. But as you know, it happened over decades, and it slowly impacted more and more of the world until the entire world was changed. Family was dramatically changed by the industrial move, because suddenly dad's not at home for work, he's driving to work. And then that necessitated childcare or, schooling. And so now you're getting bused to schools, and suddenly home is just a place you wake up in and go to sleep in, but most of life is done outside of the home, not inside of the home. That's a pretty dramatic shift. We're in the middle of the same shift, and it's not clear exactly how many different ways it will impact us. But that shift is from industry to information. Now, one of the ways it's impact us is that ideas are everywhere now. Ideas that a kid would have never encountered, they're now encountering. They might have heard about atheists, but now atheistic ideas are smuggled in through tweets, through social media posts, through advertisements, as are Buddhist ideas. I used to do this thing, Terence, where I'd go to youth groups and I pretend to be an atheist kind of as a teaching tool, and I challenge their faith. And most of the time they were hearing things they'd never heard before. Today, if I do that, they've heard it because they've seen Stephen Hawking videos, or, Chris Hitchens videos, or Bill Maher videos. In other words, they live in the age of information, which means they live in an age of competing ideas. Which means if you and I spend our life just preaching at them instead of walking with them through the messages of culture, then we become one of the many voices that they hear throughout the day. I don't know about you, Terence. I don't like this at all, but the truth is, I'm one stop on the information bus of the week for our kids. I hope what happens at my stop is different. I hope at my stop, they're able to get prepared for the other stops, and they're able to think about the information that they're going to receive. But that's a dramatic thing. There's a very real risk that the religious influences on kids' life are just kind of like the teacher in Charlie Brown, wah, 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 because so much noises are back there. The deeper thing too, Terence, and I know you write about this and talk about this, I think it's so important, is that in an age of information, one of the things that changes is what we think it is to know. So access to information, being able to Google something, is confused with having wisdom.
Man, that's so good.
And I mean, that's just the big one. I think that there are other big cultural shifts. I'll give you one more. I could get it more, but I know I don't want to ramble on too much, but there's just so many important ones to consider. Here's the other big one, I think, is that I think we have to understand that most of the challenges to our kids' morality are actually challenges to their identity. We're tempted to look back at the last 30, 40 years and say, man, there's been a moral shift in this country. Things that were once wrong are now considered right. Things that were once right are now considered wrong, which of course is true. There's no questioning that. I mean, we've changed our morality. I think, though, the thing we need to understand is that the changes in our morality have been the fruit, not the root. That's an effect, not a cause. The deeper cause is that we've literally changed our vision on what it means to be human. I mean, the clearest example is all these cultural waves of sexuality, whether we're talking about saving sex for marriage, whether we're talking about whether divorce is okay or not, whether we're talking about, identifying as gay or lesbian or bisexual or queer or trans. We oftentimes as Christians, especially in our generation, Terrence, will talk about whether it's right or wrong to do those things. The culture is saying, this is who I am. This is who I am. This is who I am. And you can go to music, like, for example, and this has been for decades now, whether we're talking about, the Born This Way song by Lady Gaga, or Love is Love, by Macklemore, or even in more recent days, just this idea, I'm a freak, or you hear this language come up over and over and over. And then you go to what they hear about in school, which, if there, many schools will teach them from the very beginning that this is the most important thing they need to figure out is their sexual orientation or gender identity, as if what they do sexually, what they feel sexually, is the essential defining characteristic of who they are. And everything else in reality has to change to accommodate that. That includes their biological parts, right? I mean, think about it. Our kids are being told that what they feel is more real than chromosomes, hormones, genitalia, or reproductive systems. It's an astonishing thing. And so that's why we really need to understand that part of the discipleship of our kids, maybe the first part, is not just what God expects of them. In other words, not just how God wants them to behave, but what God says about them, that they're made in the image and likeness of God, that their deepest and core identity is not bound up in feelings or emotions or instincts or impulses or attractions. Their deepest understanding, their deepest identity as a human being is their relationship with God.
Yeah.
And that's the other big shift, because there's not a more consistent message that a kid growing up in these cultural waters will hear than a defined down, silly, sexualized version of their identity. And man, we know ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims.
Yeah.
And the bad ideas about sex, oh man, how many victims are we seeing all around us?
And they're having to make that decision, or being inundated with these ideas and concepts at a very early age.
Early. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy.
I can't even remember talking about something. I mean, we didn't talk about this. We were playing baseball and they're trying to figure out how to play marbles or something, Yeah, we weren't thinking about, sex and all this other identity stuff, but at that age. And now our kids are really asking those questions at a very early age.
Yep.
And we have to be prepared to give an answer, because that answer isn't going to come from institutions that we once relied on, in my opinion. So I'd love for you to share a third point, because, as a good speaker, you always need 3 points. And just to leave you with
you want
two.
Me to get one more?
Yeah. Just to leave you with two just doesn't seem to be fair. And then I'll wrap up with a question. But go ahead and
you bet.
Maybe share one of those third points that you.
Well, one of the third points is one of the things that you just mentioned. And that is, you can't trust the institutions we used to trust. So you go back to the 19th century, middle of the 1800s, and America's kind of in its rowdy, adolescent stage. And Alexis de Tocqueville, this French intellectual, comes over, looks at the United States, and starts to write about it. And one of the things he says is that one of the distinctions of American culture, is not that it had some sort of a superior form of government, or not that it, somehow had superior citizens, because obviously during that time, that we were still, dealing with our deepest national sin of slavery. And he noted that too. But one of the things he did note was that America was unique in that it had a particularly thick middle. And what that means is there's the government and then there's the individual citizen. And most governments at some level will pit individual citizens versus governmental power. But the American experience had such a strong cultural middle, and that both cultivated the citizens, into the American way of life, and it also kept the big government from becoming too tyrannical. Now, of course, it also maintained local cultural norms. Many of them, particularly in the South, were dreadful and sinful. But one of the most profound shifts in American culture over the last 5 or 6 or 7 decades has been that those institutions that made America so strong in the middle have become weak and thin. The family is the first one. Look, Chuck Colson used to say, it's either the conscience or the constable. Either you will govern and rule yourself, or you will be ruled by someone in power. The family is the primary institution that successfully allows kids to rule themselves, to develop things like self-control, and to live out of a sense of delayed gratification instead of immediate gratification. When the family is weak, then those characteristics aren't part of their lives. I just actually spent a little bit of time writing on an article that was in the Atlantic that basically looked and said, the latest pandemic to inflict America is family estrangement. And listen to what this researcher said. He said, most of the time, families are being estranged because people are saying stuff like, you're interfering with my happiness. You're getting in the way of me fulfilling my purpose. In other words, in the past, families were pretty much understood, and family dignity and family responsibility was understood, that I have a responsibility to the family. Now, increasingly, families are being broken up, not because someone is failing to fulfill their duty to the family, but because someone is saying the family fails to fulfill its duty to make me happy. That's a remarkable shift. We can also talk about the thinning out of church. I mentioned earlier the non-essential church. I mean, look, I understand government officials use that phrase and put a whole bunch of things in that category. I'm not nearly as concerned what Gavin Newsom says about the church as I am about what most of the members of our churches that, found out, I can just, go online and I don't actually have to relationally be committed to one another in this church environment anymore. That's a thin society, not to mention, the degradation of state power, not to mention all kinds of other things. That's a pretty dramatic thing. Now, one of the realities that comes out of that, Terence, is all these other institutions, family, communities, the church, these things have become more and more thin, but they're designed to carry some of the cultural weight. When those things are really thin, guess what gets all the cultural weight? Politics. and perhaps we saw, during 2020, just how volatile American society is, how we're just at the verge of explosion, all the time at a level that we haven't seen probably since the 70s. Why? Because we live in a cultural moment where far too much weight is being carried by politics. Now, I'm not trying to let any politician off the hook for their rhetoric or their behavior or their policies or anything like that. What I am trying to say is salvation doesn't come in Air Force One, and cultural collapse doesn't come in Air Force One either. These are all pre-political realities. And right now, the pre-political institutions are letting us down. Now, we see that, and we might be able to separate those things. But a younger generation is, all they're knowing is they live in a culture where all the headline says everything's on the brink of disaster all the time. And that's a high level of stress. Yeah. It's almost like we've put the weight of the world on the next election or the next headline or the next bill or the next Supreme Court appointment. And it's just squashing us, and we feel it, and we're trying to hold it up, but it's too heavy for us. Mm-hmm. And all these other things God created to allow us to take some of the weight have thinned out, which, by the way, should tell you and me, if we want to help our own kids deal with the stresses of life in the modern world, let's have a strong family. Let's have a place where they come back and they realize, look, we got your back no matter what. I'm not about making you happy. You're not about making me happy. Your primary loyalty needs to be to this group of people. And from that loyalty, you can be loyal to your church. And from that loyalty, you can be loyal to your community. And that's the way it's got to go. I think it's a wonderful opportunity, by the way, for Christians as well. All these crises are also opportunities, right? So in a culture that doesn't know what it means to be human and defines humanity down to sex, we've got the image of God. What a cool thing that is, right? In a culture that just throws out messages as if there's no tomorrow and there's no discernment, we have a lens through which we can discern. In other words, we've got great answers to all of these cultural crises if we take the time to apply them.
Oh, that's right on. And I think, you know, we talk about here, Victoria's family needs to be home centered and church supported. And
Hmm.
we flip that, and sometimes we don't even make it church supported. We've got to begin to take up our mantle, take up our role, take up our responsibility in the home. But you know, there's a recent survey that came out about 65% of parents feel inadequate to do that.
Yeah.
And I'm an optimist by trade, so I'm thinking they want to do the right thing. They just don't know how.
Yeah, that's
We've
right.
gotten so far away from center. We simply don't know where to start. And so we're being intentional.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say we can help in that regard. Well, John, I like to wrap up this session with this. You mentioned that this idea of a bus stop.
Yeah.
And on your bus stop, you like for that stop to look different than the other stops.
Yeah.
In summary, give us an idea of that bus stop.
Yeah.
What would it
That's
look
such
like in today's postmodern society?
Yeah, man, that's such a great question. And I'm like you, where I'm realizing all kinds of times where my bus stop needs to be painted or cleaned up or swept. And thankfully, I have my wife who's so good at so many of these things. But I'll tell you a couple things we try to bring in. The first thing is habits, different habits. One of the ways that culture impacts hearts and minds is not just by what it says to us, but the rhythms that it puts us in. I mean, think about it. Other than this year because of COVID, we take as a nation, we spend Thursday giving thanks, the Thursday in November giving thanks, and the very next day we trample security guards for flat screen TVs, right? Now, no one's out there beating the pulpit going, stuff is more important than people, but we have a culture in which stuff is more important than people. And why? Well, because it comes through habits. It comes through just the rhythms that culture puts you in. And so you have to separate and rethink and say, in what ways is my life being more shaped by culture than by my faith? And what I buy and what I look at, just for example, the rhythms of constantly trying to be entertained or amused. So a couple of the rhythms in our home is, no phones in the bedroom. That's just simple. Because I know the cultural rhythm is that the culture is going to consistently try to keep my kids attached digitally, and that's not good for their souls. Another one is Sabbath. Sabbath is a very countercultural idea, but from Saturday night dinner to Sunday night dinner, we unplug, we don't do screens, we try not to do commerce, just to be in a different place. Rhythms of being in the Word, rhythms of how we do education, and so think about those rhythms. The second thing that is a big part of our bus stop is questions. And this goes to that point where you can just be the Charlie Brown teacher in the background. But the two greatest educators in history were Socrates and Jesus. They didn't have a whole lot in common, but they did have one thing in common, and that is they were great at asking questions. And we ask our kids questions more than we try to tell them things, I'll give you, in our book, we list out 5 or 6 questions that you can just keep in your back pocket, but I'll give you one that I found to be really, really helpful. It's the question, what do you mean by that? In a culture where there's so much information, you'll often find yourself using the same vocabulary, but not the same dictionary as the culture, right? So when you say God and the culture says God, you may not be talking about the same guy. Or if you say truth and they say truth, here's the biggie, the word love. The cultural lexicon for love is sentimental or sexual. The biblical definition of love is deep friendship. It's a sacrificial love. It's the goodness of God's creation that we are able to have affection for. These are the things C.S. Lewis wrote about. And so we try to throw that question out a lot when our kids, use a word like truth. Well, what do you mean by truth? or freedom. What do you mean by freedom? What is freedom? Look, we don't agree on what freedom is in our culture, and the different definition of words makes a big difference. And the great point, the great thing about questions is that they create dialogues instead of monologues. They allow you to really get to the heart of what someone really thinks and believes. And man, you've had this experience. I had this experience when someone clarifies a definition. It's like, oh, I mean, that's a thought-changing moment. And because our definitions are the building blocks of our hearts and minds. And so those are two things that are really important in our home.
That's so good.
Yeah, I mean, we could get out with it, but those are two that we start with.
Well, brother, I tell you, man, I've enjoyed this conversation. We could go on for another 3-4 weeks and probably won't even touch the base. But for those who want to find more information around these practical guides to culture, where can they find more information, my friend?
Well, hey, I really appreciate that. The Practical Guide to Culture book, you can find it on Amazon. You can find it on CBD, wherever you get books. There's also been a student guide to culture based on that content that was written for high schoolers. So we really aim for really high school freshmen, high school sophomores with that one. So just two ways. We have had a lot of families go through that book, and with the kids going through the student guide. And then other than that, I always say, if you're on Twitter, you can find me at JB Stonestreet. If you're not on Twitter, don't start. It'll ruin your life. And then the other place, of course, is the daily commentary BreakPoint, which you can just go to breakpoint.org or look up BreakPoint wherever you get your podcast.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've had a winning Friday here and a winning a commentary. And thank you, John, for just words of wisdom. Parents, I hope that you've been encouraged. Pastors and leaders, I hope you've been encouraged and tune in and get those practical guides to culture. Our culture is shifting, and we need to be aware of that. But we know the solution. We know the defense against it. So thank you, John, for just an excellent time together. Looking forward to catching up with you, my friend.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Terence. God bless you, brother.
Same to you, brother. What I'll do is I'll shoot you